G'day, mate. Luke Ford here with John David Ebert. John, you just came out with your autobiography. What led you to finally write and release your autobiography?
Well, let's see. I had been trying to write an autobiography ever since my marriage broke up. I was married for 15 years, and it broke up. We divorced in 2008. And then in 2013, she put legal machinations in the way of me being able to see my son. I didn't have the money to fight it, to pay for a lawyer. So I was a little bit frustrated. So I thought I would just tell the story and get it out there publicly, because I at least had that much power on my side. So I sat down to write the story, but I gave it to my friends, and they're like, this is not your best book. There's kind of, the tactics here are a little bit too vengeful. I mean, you need more objectivity. Give it some time. So my friends are brutally honest. So I said, okay, so I'll wait a while. A few years went by, and then I had a relationship with a girl named Mary Church that was very traumatic to me. She ended up committing suicide, and that impelled me then to go onto YouTube. And because I couldn't figure it out in a written version, I was having trouble finding a voice for it. I thought I would just talk it off the top of my head on YouTube videos. And that seemed to work. Just getting on there and talking it through seemed to work. And my friends were saying, these are really entertaining. You should turn these into a book. So I did then. What I did was I sat down and I transcribed every one of the videos, then re-edited it into a readable prose format. So the book is quite a bit different from the videos. For a number of reasons. You can go on there and watch the videos for free, but you won't be getting a lot of stuff that I censored, because I didn't want to get kicked off of YouTube. I didn't mention Mary Church by name. She was still alive at that point when I was doing the YouTube videos. I left out all kinds of stuff. But the autobiography, I pretty much put 90% of my life into it. I only held back a few things. So it's brutally honest. And I think it's very readable. My friends went over it with a fine-tooth comb, telling me what worked, what didn't, what I should leave out. Maybe you're going over the top here, being too honest about this, that, or the other thing. So in dialogue with my friends, I got a final copy. And then Mary killed herself just as I was nearing the end of that. So that provided, in a way, the book's dramatic climax. So then I finished the book and put it out and published it because I wanted that whole story to be told. And that was the main reason.
Now, who was Mary Church?
Mary Church was a very talented artist that I encountered through Facebook. She contacted me, I think in 2014 originally. She was half my age. At that point, I think she was 24 years old, maybe 23. And she was a student in Johnson City, Tennessee, at the art school there. And so she was midway through working on an art degree. And then she contacted me on Facebook very shyly and asked me what I thought of her artwork. And I gave her my criticisms about it. I didn't think she was flirting with me or anything like that. I get a lot of people who come to me asking for my opinion, men and women, asking for my opinion about their works. So I gave her my opinion, and then she hung up. She had found me because one of her art teachers had said she should read 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari. And of course, she bought the book and then couldn't make heads or tails of it, because it's a very, very difficult thing to read, especially if you're not acquainted with philosophy. So she went on to YouTube looking for someone who might be able to explain the book to her, and she found all of my videos. I did a chapter by chapter series on it on YouTube. She started binge watching those. Then she started watching all my stuff. She became addicted to philosophy through me and watching all my videos, and she became one of my biggest fans over the next couple of years there, probably from 2013, 14, 15, down in there. She was just binge watching all of my stuff. And then so we finally reconnected in 2016 after she'd done a fantastic series of art, black and white paintings based on my Decline of the West podcast that I did with Daryl Cooper. She created this race of beings caught in a planetary scale catastrophe. I thought they were quite extraordinary. So I messaged her back on Facebook that these were a quantum leap over what she had shown me 2 years ago. And at that point, we began talking back and forth, and I realized she was indeed flirting with me at that point. And it just took off very rapidly from there on Facebook. We were talking to each other all day long, every day, all day. What I didn't know, though, about her, I assumed that she was just an artist. I didn't know that she was a webcam model because she didn't tell me that at first. I'd never interacted with a webcam model and still haven't. I find it to be too high pressure of a way of interacting. So she said, because I told her, at one point that in my autobiography, I had talked about how I hadn't written it yet, but I talk about this, how my ex and I, at one point, were involved in the sex industry. And I had no problems with my ex doing that. She had tried phone sex for a while. I thought that was funny, actually. She did that for about a month and quit because the pay was just minimum wage. So it wasn't worth the effort. But I thought the whole thing was amusing. And I was explaining this to Mary over the phone. And then she said, well, actually, I don't work at a CVS. I'm a webcam model. Can you handle that? And I said, yeah, I don't see, what's the difference? It's like a higher class version of phone sex, right? I mean, or a more up-to-date technological version of it. So I didn't think it would be a problem. So when I went out to live with her a few months later, it was indeed, I totally underestimated the stress that it would put me under as a man. It was something else. I couldn't deal with it. And so the whole relationship crashed and burned at that point for that iteration. But there was a series of subsequent iterations of the relationship over the next 3 years. But that was the 2016 version. So that's the short version of the story.
And why did she kill herself?
For a number of reasons. Number one, I think the primary reason was that she was severely mentally ill, paranoid schizophrenic. She thought people were following her around. At first, I didn't notice anything like that. This wasn't until the third iteration of our relationship in 2018, when she was living in Hawaii, and she had quit the sex industry, converted to radical feminism, and was very anti-men this, anti-men that, anti-porn this, and just, filling my ear full of invective about all this crap that I just ignored. And we had some really great conversations during that summer. We talked about philosophy and culture and art. It was a really good relationship, with the stress of the sex work out of the way. But then she started getting paranoid. She started saying really weird things to me, and she started calling me Seth. She started saying I was a demon from another world, and I realized this person is schizophrenic, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And the stress of that caused us to break off there again for like the third or fourth time in October of 2018. She went back home to her parents in November, and then she decided to acquire a 38 caliber gun because she was afraid people were going to hurt her. She was collecting weapons, a stun gun and mace and all this kind of stuff while living with her parents. And so she got the weapon off the street, from what I have heard, got it from off the street. And, the other main reason was that she was very despondent about our relationship. She didn't think it would ever continue. She was extremely depressed about it. I was pretty much the only man she ever loved. And she really wanted me, but she was mad at herself, mad at me, just a lot of feelings of guilt. So all these factors sort of combined, the ending of our relationship, hopelessness about it, the mental illness, the schizophrenia about people following her around. And pretty soon she just felt like she was in a box and shot herself one night, over Gmail while I tried to talk her out of it for about an hour.
Oh, so you were live with her in her final moments?
Yes, I was. Yeah, so after October, and we had broken up, she moves back in November to St. Petersburg, Florida. December, she buys the gun as a birthday present for herself, which is December 11th. January 16th, then I'm getting ready to go out to a dinner party, and then she pops up for the first time on my email in 3 months And she says, guess what? I just bought myself a 38 caliber revolver. I have it right here and I'm about to pull the trigger. And I said, what the fuck are you talking about? So I sat down and frantically started typing and saying, where are you? Are you in Hawaii? Are you back in Florida? Where are you at? She wouldn't tell me. So I couldn't very well call the cops or 911 if I didn't know where on the planet she was. And I kept trying to get her to tell me and she wouldn't. And then I just spent an hour trying to talk her out of it, and she wouldn't budge. She's like, "No, I'm doing this." And then, yeah, about an hour into it, bam, she just pulled the trigger. She sent me a photo of herself holding the gun to her head minutes before pulling the trigger. So
I'm thinking of the Eagles song. I found out a long time ago what a woman can do to your soul, but she can't take
yeah,
you any way you don't already know how to go. So why did Mary Church affect you so deeply?
because I loved her. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I loved her despite her insanity, craziness, promiscuity, all these things that pretty much I think turned most men off, if not all of them. She never had a stable relationship. She just went through the men. Um, Never really had a boyfriend. One time was in a one-sided relationship for 3 months where she felt like she loved the guy, but the guy was just using her as a fuck doll, basically. That's pretty much all they did, these men. I was the only guy that she ever loved, that she ever fell in love with, that she knew she wanted, you know. And I loved her beyond just her physical beauty and sexuality. I loved her for who she was, you know. It was just love. And, you know, I don't know how else to put it.
Though I'm sure you've thought a little bit about this, and I don't want to push you to go anywhere you don't want to go, but
No, where you want.
why did you love her? For example, if we were to discuss, say, a text from the book of Genesis, and if I was to tell you, John, this is my favorite text in the whole Bible, you might be curious, why does this particular text speak to you so much? What is it about these few words that lights your fire? So what was it about Mary Church that got under your skin and that caused you to love her?
We were just on the same wavelength. Um, there's an almost metaphysical dimension to it where we just got each other. We understood each other very well, and the communication back and forth was totally effortless. I have trouble a lot with women communicating with them and always feeling like there's just a disconnect, and I'm not being heard or listened to. And it was never that way with her. It was effortless conversation between the two of us, back and forth, no matter how much we talked or how long we talked or how many hours a night we talked. It was always completely effortless. So there was a real deep core connection there between the two of us. And I liked her for a lot of reasons. Her emotional cartography resonated with mine. I just liked how profound and deep she was. I liked her darkness. I liked that she was in love with death. I liked all of these kinds of qualities about her that would have turned off almost any man. I liked that stuff, you know. I like unusual women, and she just had all these qualities about her beyond the physical that I saw through to the core of her. And as a result of that, I wrote an entire poetry collection about her called Gravity Girl, which is a book that is entirely about who I saw her as in essence, beyond the physical. And that book blew her away. And it was, you know, love poems that you don't come across those just every day of that quality, singing the praises of a woman. She's just complex. I like complexity. I don't like boring people. I don't like stereotypical people. I don't like simple people. She's just really a complex knot. And I'm attracted to complexity. You know, in philosophy as well as in relationships. And she was very talented. She was a great artist. I mean, there were a million things that I liked about her.
Did you learn anything about yourself from this process of falling in love with this girl and having your insides turned upside down?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think I did learn quite a bit about myself, about my capacity to forgive someone. She repeatedly stabbed me in the back again and again and again. And I forgave every time. I didn't have any reason to, and most men would not have. Most men would have dumped her, as most men, in fact, did dump her after using her for sex for a few weeks or a couple of months. And that was never what I wanted. I was always trying to figure out a way to love her in a way that would make it work and not be so crazy. But the two of us just were extremely intense together. It was just very, very intense. It's like we couldn't even be in the same room together without driving each other crazy because of the energy between us. It's like particle physics or something, getting two particles together that just, drive each other crazy. But no, I learned a lot about myself, a lot about, what love is and how it's not a simple thing at all. I loved my ex. I learned about love from my ex for 15 years, but that was a completely different relationship because I was never passionately in love with my ex. It was just a good companion, a sort of a mild, slow burn that extended over 15 years. It wasn't intense. It was loving. And, she loved me, I loved her. It was a loving relationship. That's why it went 15 years. And but there was no passion. If I had ever written love poems to my ex, she would have ridiculed me. Been, what is this shit? What are you talking about? This isn't us. So very, very different kind of love. This was with Mary Church, a passionate love to the point where I felt like I was going to die if I couldn't have her. I mean, it's that kind of love. And I guess I've never experienced that before in my life. I've had other girlfriends, but nothing like that. Nothing even close.
Do you think you would have had this intense love if you'd not had sex with her?
Well, I don't know. Maybe at first it was primarily sexual. When we were talking back and forth at first on Facebook, we were sexting an awful lot, and she was telling me about her webcam job and telling me the stuff, that she was doing with men every night. So yeah, a lot of stuff turned me on. And then we met in a motel room and had sex for 5 days, and the chemistry was explosive. I mean, it was incredible. That's a tough question to answer, but I think probably not if the sex hadn't been in there. But, in a way, the sex was kind of like bait on the end of a fish hook to get me into a much larger pool, a much larger emotional pool. It's like the fish sees the shiny, glittering thing and goes for it, and then realizes, whoa, I'm in a whole different environment here. So I would put it like that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly what was going on. She drew you into her world, and she snagged you like a fish on a hook.
I thought it was just going to be just a quick affair. Yeah. That was my thinking about getting her out to the motel room. Let's see if we can get along, first of all. But I assumed in the back of my mind it was just going to be a cheap and dirty affair, and that's that. But that isn't what happened.
I remember I dated an ex-porn star, so she'd been out of the industry a month or two. Oh, yeah. She tested completely clean. Her mother was an English teacher, so she was erudite. I've never dated anyone who does not enjoy reading books. And I thought this is great because the sex was fantastic, and I thought there's no way I'm going to get emotionally involved. But I realized I am not capable of having intense sex repeatedly without getting emotionally involved. And what happened was that after a few weeks of intense sex, then her porn passed. I could not handle it. Like when I didn't care about her, her previous sex work meant nothing to me. But once I fell in love with her, then her previous sex work drove me crazy. And I was talking to a friend about it, and this one particular scene that she did with two guys, and my friend said, "Well, at least she isn't racist." But that wasn't particularly calming. I could not handle it. Once I fell in love with it, I could not handle her having
Yeah.
been a sex worker.
It's the same exact scenario. Exactly the same. Yes.
Yeah, because do you remember the time that you realized that you're in over your head? That initially you thought this would just be fun. There had to be a moment of realization.
Oh, well, yeah, it was after the 5 days in the motel room in Phoenix. I flew her out to where I was at in Phoenix. And then those 5 days went so well that shipping her back was really upsetting to me. And I was like, why am I so upset? I just thought this would be an affair. Um, no, I fell in love with her pretty quickly after that point. And we started talking again. And I was like, well, 2 weeks later, I should just move out to your place there in Florida and be with you. I pretty much knew at that point that I was in. And then as soon as I got there, of course, it was fantastic. Everything was fantastic. It was for a while until she started the webcam.
What was the longest that you spent with her in the same place?
Oh, 7 weeks. The 1 week in the motel room, and then 6 more weeks at her apartment in St. Petersburg.
Mm-hmm.
So we were only together physically for 7 weeks. The rest was all long distance, virtual, Skype, Gmail, phone.
And I think that would have something to do with it. I'm thinking about the last woman that I fell in love with. She broke up with me half a dozen times in the course of a year. And that added incredible intensity to our relationship, because when we'd get back together, I'd fuck her like my life depended on it. Like this would be the very last time. And that provided an intensity that would not have been there if we hadn't been frequently separated. So I'm thinking that the absence that you would have with her would have added to the intensity.
It did. So all the other sex was virtual, phone sex and Skype sex and all of that for the next 2 years of the relationship.
And had you had such an intense sexual relationship before?
No. Well, no, not that intense. No.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of the concept of love?
Nothing like that.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of the concept of love map?
No, what's this?
I think you might enjoy it. It's a person's emotional internal blueprint for their ideal erotic sexual situation. So it's a developmental representation or template in the mind of the brain depicting the idealized lover and idealized program of sexual and erotic activity. So, for example, and it's usually formed between ages 5 and 8. So for me, my love map is that I'm a strong, powerful person and that I have a woman who wants to please me, because it's kind of a reaction to feeling humiliated. So what happens is we try to thread this erotic minefield by telling ourselves a story. And so for me, I tell myself the story of what a powerful, strong man I am, because my greatest fear is that I'm a weak nothing and I don't want to be humiliated. So in my erotic, the erotic cogs in my mind, they work. I'm threading my way through a minefield so that I have to have the possibility of humiliation, failure, and rejection to make me feel fully alive. But I don't want to experience it. I want to overcome it. So I will design scenarios where I'll say, okay, can you play my teacher when I was in 7th grade? Or can you play my therapist? Or whatever. I take some haughty woman and I subjugate her with my enormous, sexual power, and by it splits me up. Though that's the problem. One part of me, I'm telling myself this erotic story to make the scenario so exciting, but the other part of me knows that I'm telling myself a story. So I play out this story. I thread my way through the erotic minefield. Let's say I get satisfaction. I feel great that I have overcome the humiliation of my life, particularly my childhood, but it just kind of ingrains this need to play out these scenarios because it's just so deeply embedded in my consciousness that I have to play this sort of erotic game. I don't know if any of that speaks to you in any way.
That's really interesting. No, that is. I'd never heard of it or thought of it that way before. That's fascinating. You said this already formed by the time you're 8 years old?
Yeah. Yeah, Robert Stoller, a UCLA psychiatrist, says that perversion is the eroticized form of hatred. But essentially, we cannot get sexually excited without dealing with our greatest angers and fears. And then we construct scenarios by which we overcome our deepest humiliations, fears, and our deepest form of pain. And then we create scenarios whereby we overcome and transform and transcend this pain through some sort of erotic scenario. And it essentially it's perversion is the eroticized form of hatred. That really spoke to me. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I'll send you some links. I was absolutely fascinated when I remember when I was in a writing class. I thought, it'd be a great idea to write about what I find erotic. And so the scenarios I find most erotic were getting women to succumb to my tremendous, sexual power. And so I read this essay to my therapist, and he says, "Oh, it sounds like you have eroticized rage." And I never heard of that term, but I went and looked it up and go, "Oh yeah, I think I got a problem there."
Fascinating.
So for some people, they have a drink and suddenly all their problems disappear, like their social awkwardness disappears, their lack of meaning in their life disappears, their lack of excitement in their life disappears, their inability to dance disappears, their fear of approaching women disappears. And so
I've had all that with alcohol. It does all that to me.
So I dated an erotic photographer, Holly Randall, and she was her mother, Suze Randall, a famous erotic photographer. So Holly grew up in the porn industry. When she was a little girl, she'd wander into the garden, and Randy West would be there masturbating, getting ready for a scene. So we had matching love maps. So mine was to dominate, hers was to be dominated. And so when we'd have sex, she'd like plead with me to fuck her like a whore. And so we had a very, intense.
Your candor, Luke. This is not the average, ordinary, everyday interview.
I totally get where you were coming from. And when I did a video discussing your video, it came from a sense of I've been there, man. It was nothing. There was nothing else but I've been there. And so when I hear you talk about Mary Church, I just can tell you I've absolutely been there. And I remember I had this intense up and down relationship with Holly. And then one day she said, my therapist tells me I'm a love addict. And I'd never heard of that term. But just like for some people, alcohol can transform everything that sucks into something that's wonderful, so too an intense feeling of love and eros can transform one's life in a similar way. Did you have any sense of transformation from your erotic and romantic ventures with Mary?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Love is the best drug there is. And yeah, it was a high. Every time things were going good with us, things could not be better. I mean, it was better than any drug ever. Because when things went well, they went really well. And we just had good personality chemistry bouncing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. During that last summer that we connected in 2018, I think we were talking every night for 5 hours over the phone, 5 hours a night. How many people, how can you sustain a 5-hour conversation relentlessly every night for 4 months or 5 months, however it was? That's just the kind of chemistry we had. And we were hatching a lot of ideas about books that we wanted to do together, that I would write and she would illustrate. We were planning a graphic novel together, a whole bunch of stuff. It really is sad that it crashed and burned after that, because in many ways that was our best period. And it was looking like we were finally figuring out how to collaborate together on new projects. And we had a bunch of stuff lined up. But then her mental illness just came in and made everything wobbly, unworkable.
When I fell for Holly Randall, initially I thought, I'm not going to fall for this girl because she's not a 10, she's not a 9, she's not an 8, she's a 6, but she's just very sexy, enthusiastic, lovely person who's erudite. And so I completely, fell head over heels without expecting that this could possibly happen. And then at the time I was writing a blog about the porn industry, a daily, blog about the industry. Instead, I just started writing about Holly every day.
Uh,
So my readers weren't
well,
particularly thrilled, but I just lost my
yeah,
mind over this girl. But
right.
I mean, Mary
I've had,
Church,
I've had friends too who have dated porn stars who also had similar experiences
yeah.
of frustration and not being able to deal with their past or their current work. Yeah, it's more common, I guess, than the average person would think.
I was doing a YouTube show with an academic. So I'm talking about a professor who's married with 3 kids, who's middle aged. And one day I said, hey, let's do some shows on Mein Kampf. And he read Mein Kampf, and it just flipped him out the same way that Mary Church flipped you out. And he became like this 1488 ship posting troll online, and he just destroyed his life.
Oh wow.
So for some people, it's a book that can turn you upside down, and then for you, it was a cam girl. But there are
Woman.
things,
Yeah.
yeah,
Woman.
there are things that can activate you. And I told him after he burned up his life, I said, Mein Kampf and this whole experience, it was giving you insights into a part of you that was not alive, that was just lying dormant. You were just going through the motions of living until I triggered you with some dissident material, and then you suddenly came alive. So is there anything to the idea that you were, even though you're highly productive and living the life of the mind, but in a sense you were just sleepwalking until you encountered Mary Church, and however horrific this experience has been, she has awoken you to a dimension and to parts of yourself that you need to explore.
That's 100% correct. In fact, at the time that we met back in 2016 over Facebook, I was in a mode which I'd been in for about a year or two, giving up. I'd lost my kid, and that was in 2013, and then I think I spent most of 2014 drunk every day on vodka all day long. I would do nothing, write nothing, and I was just drinking all day long every day. Did about 3 or 4 months of that, went into detox, came out, went back to the alcohol, not hard liquor, beer, but still doing that. And I was totally unmotivated to do anything else. I had already, by that point, published, I think, 20 something books, 20-ish, right around 20. And I wasn't getting much back from social media the way it is nowadays. Most people were ignoring me. I just didn't see much reason to keep going. So I remember moping around quite a bit at the time that Mary then contacted me in the summer of September of 2016. Then, yeah, that did turn everything around. And my life has been turned upside down ever since, but boring it has not been. It's not been boring in these past 3 years, no matter how stormy it's been or how crazy I've been. And nobody makes me crazier than she does. Nobody. She's still doing it, even though she's dead. So that gives you some idea of the intensity of it. But no, it hasn't been boring. And I have managed to remain productive, put out quite a few books during this period, 10 books, something like that.
Now, most people are going to react to your description of your experience with Mary Church by mocking you. How do you deal with that?
I don't care. They're not in my shoes. How do they know what I'm feeling? Relationships are the easiest thing to mock. You see a person who's been turned upside down and made a total fool out of by a woman. It's easy to laugh at them. It's the easiest thing in the world until it happens to you. And I can guarantee you that it will at some point, and then it's not so funny. So.
And let me just ask, where are you in alcohol these days?
It's a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. I go through periods of sobriety, periods of binging. I'm a binge drinker. I've been sober lately, but something will trigger me, and very often it has something to do with Mary. Lately, those have been the primary triggers. That sends me on a downward spiral yet again. Manic mood swings, crazy social media behavior. All of that is alcohol triggered, all of it. So I behave pretty well. I don't have any alcohol in me.
When did you first realize that you weren't in full control of yourself?
Oh, well, when I was diagnosed with bipolarity, that was back after my divorce in 20, let's see, maybe 2010. I was living in Boulder, and I finally got the diagnosis of bipolarity, and I was like, "What? I'm bipolar? What the hell is that?" I didn't even know what it was, and so I'd gone for years without even knowing that these mood swings that I've had, they were never this bad. Back like in my marriage, they were never this bad, but that's when I realized that there were two sides to me. One side that I have no control over whatsoever, because that side, if I drink enough alcohol, it takes about 7 or 8 beers. Once I'm that far in, something happens in my brain chemically, and a switch is flipped where I lose control of my behavior. I don't know what I'm saying. I don't know what I'm doing. Usually it's going to be a blackout that I won't remember the next day. I can't count how many times I've had rants on social media and then woken up the next day and completely forgotten about them and looked at them to my horror and said, what the hell went on here last night? So it is, there are two people in me. But that second person is activated by the alcohol, which has gotten worse over time, as all these diseases do. So it's a struggle. It's not an easy thing. I've been in and out of detox wards and psych wards maybe 10 times over the past 6, 7 years, something like that. It never works. I come out and I'm fine for a few days, and then I go back to the alcohol because I miss the euphoria. It causes a lot of euphoria before it causes the chemical switch where I switch over into anger. And that becomes the default mode. I just get very, very angry. And then that as a norm for me is compounded times 1,000 by dealing with the grief of Mary Church's suicide. That has made these past 2 years a living hell. On top of that kind of behavior, dealing with the grief and the anger at her. I still love her, and I still have a lot of emotions of love toward her, but I also have a lot of anger. And the alcohol brings up the anger, and hence the rants. So it's, I'm having a rough time getting control of myself. I'm on meds regularly. I take them every day. That's not an issue. I have a psychiatrist. I see her regularly. I get help. I've gone to AA. I've gone to groups, done group therapy, none of which I like. I don't like groups. I don't like AA. AA has a kind of robotic mentality. It's like a religion. It's a bunch of dogma that they spoon feed you, and you chant around in a group like you're in a cult or something. None of that works for me. I've done outpatient therapy, which works a lot better because it doesn't have that kind of robotic mantra recitation bullshit. So I've done better in groups. I'm sober every now and then for.
Oh, your camera is suddenly frozen. Let's see if your internet comes back soon. So, talking to John David Ebert here. You're back. Okay, your camera froze. Your camera froze about 45 seconds ago. So, do you want
Oh,
to?
I see. Okay.
Is there anything you'd like to say from the last 45 seconds? Because we completely lost you.
Oh no, I was just talking about
Okay.
what a struggle all this is.
Okay.
Dealing with bipolarity and
Yeah.
alcoholism, and grief over the suicide of someone I loved very much. And I have never in my life had a person commit suicide on me. That's another thing. This is all new to me. Whereas everyone else I know has had people, even in their 30s, has had someone commit suicide on them, someone close, a friend or a relative. I made it to 50, without ever having to go through this. I thought I was going to get a free pass, no such luck.
So I've never done drugs or alcohol, but my drug has been sex addiction, love addiction, or that kind of excess, porn, like
I've got
nights.
that too. I've got that as well. There's a reason why both Mary and my ex were sex industry workers,
Yeah.
and we're both also sex addicted as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of bipolarity.
Mm-hmm.
Bipolarity, the manic phase of it, you flip over into sex addiction. You watch too much porn, or you go out seeking risky scenarios, which I've done as well. Especially with my ex-wife and I, we did a whole lot of risky stuff. We ran a prostitution agency, for a year together. We did a lot of risky stuff. So, yeah, sex addiction has been another problem as well.
Yeah, my family was so worried about me. I wrote a blog on the porn industry for a decade. And my family was so worried about me, they paid for me to go back to Australia to see doctors of their choice, including a psychiatrist to diagnose me with the personality disorder of the histrionic narcissistic type. Luke is very dependent on other people for his identity as a person. He has poor identity integration, poor self-esteem. Luke is always looking for mirroring. It's called narcissistic supply. Luke is always looking for external validation of himself as a person. He needs other people to tell him who he is. So that kind of inspired me to go back to therapy. But for me, it was like porn. It was women. I'd lose my mind over women because that experience of being in love, or that experience of erotic intensity, just made all my other problems disappear. Like when I was in love, when I was hung up on a woman, or when I was in a great sexual relationship, then suddenly my life was transformed, and everything that was humdrum and boring, that receded. So for me, it was like looking at porn would just like make all the colors brighter and sharper, and erotic excitement would just like make me feel alive.
Yeah, well, it does, absolutely. Yeah, that's so to speak.
Yeah, so the metaphor that I use for my addictive, self-destructive side is I imagine a guillotine over my neck. And the thing that keeps the guillotine from cutting off my head is that I have to maintain certain practices, that I have to do certain things every day. So I don't know, do you have a metaphor? Do you have a way of thinking about your self-destructive side?
That prevents me from engaging in it?
Or do you just have a metaphor? For me, it's the guillotine. That's what I use. But do you have a metaphor or a way of understanding your destructive side?
No, not really. No.
How do you think about your side that wants to propel you to destroy yourself?
Well, I don't know. It's just like a desire to dissolve my ego, just dissolve my sense of who I am and my self-identity into something else other than me, whether it's sex or whether it's alcohol or what. I've never done any other drugs than alcohol and marijuana. It wipes away my sense of who I am and all the problems therein, and makes me feel like, I'm in the flow now. I'm in the endorphin flow. Endorphins I'm on that river, the endorphin river. So I don't have to worry about anything during that period, however long I can make it last. And then there's always a price to pay, of course. You wake up next day depressed, blacked out, hungover. You've insulted X number of people. Your life's a mess. And then you get up and you keep going, and somehow you muddle your way through it. No, I don't really have a metaphor beyond that for that process.
Were you drinking when you made your video a couple of weeks ago about Mary Church?
Yes.
How much and what?
I was drinking beer, and I probably had a six-pack by that point.
Okay.
I don't slur my words, so you really can't tell that I've been drinking or not. Yeah. I'm not a person who slurs unless, I don't know, it's been years since I've actually slurred my words. You would have to, because my tolerance is so high, and I'm a big guy, so it'd take a couple of bottles of vodka to get me to start slurring. But no, and I can remain pretty coherent. I almost got a DUI once, not that long ago, about 2 years ago. Cops stopped me, and I was drunk on a six-pack, and he could smell it on me and shined the flashlight in my pupils. They wouldn't dilate, so he said, step out of the car. I got out of the car, and I passed all the tests. The motor skill tests I just barely passed, but the cognitive tests, he told me to recite the alphabet backwards, and I just zipped right through it. I was like, okay, yeah, never mind. So I remained cognitively pretty clear for quite a ways in.
I remember someone once
you're getting like a Rolling Stone candid interview here. I've never quite had an interview this where you're getting this much of my personal stuff out of me. This is interesting.
Well, I'm a kindred spirit. I mean, I've been through exact same things, except not with alcohol, but with women and with sex workers and cam girls and erotic photographers and porn stars who are retired and unretired, and they make me feel alive.
I ran a stable of prostitutes with my ex for a year, and did have sex with them with her permission. So it was a pretty wild ride there.
Yeah, I mean, sex workers are better in bed. Like, I've never had a woman give a blowjob the way that the pros can give one. I mean, the sex workers know what to say to you in bed. It's just a whole nother level.
That's exactly right. Because they've had a lot of experience. They know how to do it. There's nothing awkward about it. Yeah, that's exactly right.
The only women who have ever told me I love your cock are sex workers. Like, no civilian woman has ever told me I love your cock.
Just, oh, really? Well, I have. I've had both, I guess, tell me that. But.
You're a lucky man, but I mean, I was just amazed the way.
I'm average size, 6 inches, so it's nothing huge or anything. But I have been, my ex loved it. She was like, "Oh, your cock is so great. It's so pretty." And Mary was the same way about it. Mary was oral. Fellatio was her favorite thing, and she was down there like constantly. So much that it was cutting into what I would rather have intercourse. But that was her thing. She was down between my legs like every day, constantly. She knew what she was doing. So yeah. I didn't complain. But.
So I slept with Kendra Jade at Pornstar back in 1998. And then afterwards, we're catching our breath. And she turns to me and she says, that thing they say about sex workers that we're all abused as kids, she says it's actually true. We always deny it to the news media. But she says whenever I have sex, I kind of leave my body and I kind of float up to the ceiling and kind of look down on what I'm doing, that I just leave who I am when I have sex. I don't know what about Mary Church and the sex workers you've known? Did they come from a pattern of abuse and disassociation?
Mary Church was molested as a kid.
Mm-hmm. And was that fairly common with the sex workers,
My experience with the prostitutes at the agency,
mm-hmm.
I didn't know much about their pasts, almost nothing, so I can't confirm or deny that.
Mm-hmm.
I never really learned about anyone's past. And it wasn't the case with my ex. She was not molested. She was just sex addicted.
How much intense sex does it take until you're emotionally involved? Like, I can have sex recreationally once, twice, 3 times, maybe half a dozen times, but at a certain point I get emotionally involved, even if that seems completely absurd to me. At what point is it switch from recreational to emotional for you?
I find it hard to not get emotionally involved pretty quickly. Once or twice, really. It doesn't take that much. I get pretty much emotionally involved very quickly. It's difficult for me to just have casual sex and be cold about it. I've done it, but it's I definitely prefer relationships and monogamous relationships. Those are my preference. So I look for women. Rather than having casual sex, I look more for potential relationships. But yeah, I've experienced both. So,
Yeah, I was kind of surprised how deeply and intensely I would fall for these women after enough sex, and then I'd be taken aback by their own sometimes lack of emotional involvement and their own coldness. Here I having fantastic sex with a woman, and she's not feeling nearly as emotionally intense as I am. Have you experienced that?
Wait, experience what now? I missed that last
Where
part.
you're feeling very emotionally intense about what's going on between the two of you, but she is not. And so I always expected that I'd be the strong, hard one, but now I'm the emotionally vulnerable one.
Yes, I have. Yes, absolutely. Mhm.
And how was that experience? It just threw me for a loop.
It's happened a lot where I feel like I'm the vulnerable one who wants to continue, and then I find out I'm just a fuck, and she leaves. That's happened a few times. Yeah, it's not a pleasant feeling.
No,
Um,
God,
I
no.
get attached easily. I get attached easily, actually, to the point where some women have complained that I'm clingy.
Hmm.
Um, I guess I have a fear of abandonment.
Hmm.
I have this abandonment anxiety because I was always abandoned as a kid. I was always neglected. My parents never watched me, and never gave a shit about where I was or what I was doing. So I think that's carried on into my sex life, where I have this fear of abandonment. And invariably, the woman breaks up with me rather
Yeah.
than me breaking up with her. That wasn't the case with Mary. And the 3 or 4 times we broke up, it was usually me shutting it down, because I couldn't, I would just be like, I can't take anymore. Um, but yeah,
My therapist said that when she'd hear me talk about these things, that she'd get the image of a hungry infant sucking on a breast, scared to
mm,
death that the breast was going to go dry. So he was just going to suck every
right,
last thing that he could get from the breast. And like if I'd
yeah,
have a woman come visit me for the weekend, she would typically leave exhausted because I was so needy. Like I would just drain everything I could from her, and then she would go away needy. Needy was a word that was frequently applied to me.
yeah, yeah. I reiterate once again, this is some interview, Luke. I've never, never had one like this. I have a feeling you're going to get a lot of views on this.
I had one girlfriend give me a book called The Givers and the Takers because I was such a taker, and all I'd do was suck the life out of her. Okay, I want to read you a couple of paragraphs that really spoke to me and just get your reaction to it. This
Sure.
is from Adult Children of Alcoholics. Many of us found that we had several characteristics in common as a result of being brought up in an alcoholic or dysfunctional home. We'd come to feel isolated and uneasy with other people, especially authority figures. To protect ourselves, we became people pleasers, even though we lost our own identities in the process. All the same, we would mistake any personal criticism as a threat. We either became alcoholics, practiced other addictive behavior ourselves, or married them, or both. Failing that, we found other compulsive personalities, such as a workaholic, to fulfill our sick need for abandonment. So my greatest fear is abandonment, and every time it happens, it doesn't diminish in intensity. What it does is it throws me back into that washing machine where all my fears and all my past trauma with abandonment just gets tossed around and made even more intense. So I'm not sure. Do you identify with any of that? Perhaps finding other
Yeah,
compulsive personalities who will then fulfill our sick need for abandonment.
yeah, yeah. I resonate with a lot of that too. Yeah, right.
And then here's another sentence. Having an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, we prefer to be concerned with others rather than ourselves. Does that resonate?
It does. Yeah, right.
Because I would often just be absolutely obsessed with other people and what they weren't doing. Like, why can't this girl get a life together? Like, why can't she do these right things? And I just go to my therapist, and all I wanted to talk about was this other girl. Or I go to my writing class, and all I wanted to do was,
Yeah.
talk about the other girl. Just absolutely obsessed with what she was not doing.
Well, the dynamic with Mary Church was somewhat similar to that. I was pretty much the giver, and she was the taker.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she was like a black hole. No matter how much I poured into her, it was never enough. So there was that. But there was also this other thing, this part of me where I felt like I had to rescue her from the sex industry. When I went out to live with her in St. Petersburg, I went out fully supportive of it because I thought it was fun. But then when I saw the emotional toll that it was taking on her, the degrading things that the men were making her do, and how low her self-esteem was to agree to do these things, I started to realize that this girl is really in trouble here. I mean, this thing is like a sucking whirlpool that's pulling her down. And so I took on more of a rescuer role, and I felt like, I kept trying to convince her to quit the job. And I'm not a 9 to 5er, and I am fully supportive of people who find ways around it, like my ex and I did with the prostitution agency. And I thought Mary was clever at figuring out a way to work from home, make money, and avoid 9 to 5. But this was just, it was taking too much out of her. And I kept trying to convince her to leave it, and she wouldn't do it. She kept telling me there's nothing else she can do. She has social anxiety. She can't work at a CVS. She can't work behind a cash register. And I hear all that because I have a lot of similar social anxiety issues. So I tried to work with it. I kept trying to just tell myself, it's just the shock of the new. I'll get used to it. It's just my male ego, and it's the shock of the new, and I'll just get used to it. The jealousy will pass. It'll be no big deal. But it didn't. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I got angrier and angrier and angrier at her, that she wouldn't leave. And so, yeah, so there was that dynamic too, of trying to rescue a person who just didn't want to be rescued. So that was really frustrating.
Two more sentences. We were dependent personalities, terrified of abandonment, willing to do almost anything to hold on to a relationship, to not be abandoned emotionally. Yet we kept choosing insecure relationships because they matched our childhood relationship with alcoholic or dysfunctional parents. Does any of that speak to you?
Yes, it does. I'm a child of alcoholic parents as well, as was my ex. Yeah. So all that resonates.
So, I mean, I'm long been absolutely terrified of abandonment and just incredibly willing to do almost anything to hold on to
women
someone.
have accused me of being clingy on more than one occasion. I've lost them for that reason.
And then what's sick is that I would keep choosing these very insecure, I keep choosing women who will abandon me because I can't help it. They match my need to replay this abandonment over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, and it'll probably keep happening until you resolve that gestalt, whatever that structure is in there, that's sort of like an engram that gets stuck. I do keep attracting the same type of woman over and over again, usually women with low self-esteem who are promiscuous, over and over and over again. And it's, I've been dealing with that since college, that type of scenario.
So I was, for a long time, a womanizer, but I was never willing to put much effort into it. So I just immediately get a sense that whether or not a woman's going to go to bed with me. And it turned out that virtually all of my girlfriends had fathers who were sex addicts. I don't know if you had any similar patterns.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Would you? How much effort would you put into courting a woman, or were you able to very quickly tell, hey, you're willing to put a lot of effort in?
Yeah, a lot. I'm really fussy to begin with about who I like. So I'm really picky. So it usually takes me a while, but once I find someone that I like, I invest a lot of effort into courting them. Quite a bit of effort. Sometimes it pays off, and then sometimes it crashes and burns, and I get burned yet again. And I'm left feeling like yet another woman has burned me.
How many romantic relationships have you been in your life, say, that last longer than a couple of months?
About 5. About 5.
And what do those other 4 have in common with your Mary Church experience?
They all had low self-esteem, and they were all promiscuous.
And what about the desire to rescue? Did you experience that with pretty much?
Yeah, a couple of times. A couple of times. Yes.
And you mentioned your parents were alcoholics, so they weren't particularly.
Yes. My stepfather and my mother were alcoholics. Not my father, but stepfather and mother.
And so, what did that mean growing up in their home? What did that mean for you?
Well, it meant that anything could happen at any time. It left me feeling, extremely vulnerable. That, especially with my mother. My mother was the real big problem in that scenario because she was a binge drinker. But anytime she would drink hard liquor, bourbon, and we knew, my brother and I, if we saw that bourbon bottle out, it was going to be a real bad night because then she would usually pick fights with my stepfather, who would beat her up. He was violent with her, but only if provoked. But once she got drunk, she would provoke him, and he'd beat her up, send her into the hospital numerous times. So it created an atmosphere growing up of total chaos and a total fear of vulnerability, that anything could happen to me at any time. It made things very unstable. Part of the reason why I became such an introvert, and it was reading books was a way of withdrawing into myself as a kid, withdrawing into myself. But then in high school, once I discovered drugs and alcohol, I withdrew into those. And those were good in a way because they got me out of the house. And the house had become a nightmare to live in. But in high school, I was old enough to hang out on the streets with the other kids and stay away from the house all night and do drugs, usually, just pot and alcohol, listen to loud rock and roll, park in a car somewhere in the desert, have a party, and then go home. And that became more and more and more common as high school went along, and I cared less and less and less about my studies. I still managed to get B's and C's for the most part, but yeah, that just began a series of behavioral escapes into those drugs and into sex. Sex started too at that time in high school, which became another escape. Anything to get me out of the house. So that set up a bunch of patterns, I guess, that have been with me for my whole life.
So I discovered the erotic at about age 7. How old were you when you discovered the erotic?
Oh, I would say 5. Looking at my father's Playboy magazines under the sink in the bathroom, I found those. I remember I was probably about 5, and I remember picking those up and looking at them, feeling erotic about them, and not having any clue about what that meant or anything like that. I just knew they turned me on. Playboy bunnies, I was about 5.
And how
Masturbation didn't come in though till much later. I was probably 11 or 12, and it was something I had to learn from a book. At the school library, at the elementary school where I was at, it was junior high, and there was a woman there who gathered us all together to give us a sex talk. And she said she has this book on the shelf that will answer all your questions about sexuality. I must have been 12 then, I think, if they were giving this talk. And so I checked it out immediately, and I was reading it, and I found the section on masturbation and what you're supposed to do. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try that. So I went in the bathroom and tried it, and it was a big hit. From
Yeah.
that point on, masturbation was a big hit. Yeah.
So I developed out of my childhood a tremendous fear and hatred of women. Did your experience with your mother affect the way that you
Yeah.
thought and felt about women?
Yeah, it caused a similar mixture of feelings, fear and hatred, or maybe not so much hatred, but mistrust.
Hmm.
I have trouble trusting women. I always think they're up to something. Um, yeah, I've had a lot of problems with trust issues with women, big time.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I'd be told that that all women get emotional at certain times of the month, but I was getting bounced off the walls. How about physical abuse? Were you smacked around?
Quite a bit. Yeah, from my stepfather mainly. He was a very violent, abusive man. My father too, although my father really only went on got beatings from him. My father was very sadistic. He would make me do sadistic things like lick up spilled milk off the kitchen floor. He'd make me get down and lick it up, and I had no choice. Or he would make me recite the alphabet backwards, which probably saved me from that
Yes.
DUI much later. But if I didn't get it right, smack me. say, start over. And he would make up all these weird lies, like that the teacher had called him today and said I was a bad student, which was nothing of the kind had happened. And then out of terror over him, I'd have to make up a story because I knew he wouldn't buy nothing happened. He was really weird, very sadistic. So he beat me a few times, but up until the divorce, after the divorce, when I was 7, my mother would still take my brother and I over to see him. And the beating stopped after that, pretty much. I don't remember, but not the mood swings, the weird, scary mood swings. My father was a weird, really scary individual when he had mood swings. You never knew when it was going to happen. He would turn on you on a dime and get very mean, and you would just be befuddled as to what the hell is going on here. He was a spooky individual. He used to have nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night and go running down the hallway screaming. And it would terrify my brother and I. We had no idea what was going on. But most of the beatings came from my stepfather through the rest of my childhood, probably up until I was about 10, maybe, something like that. And then I think they stopped. But yeah, there was a lot of violent abuse. No sexual abuse, no sexual molestation or anything, which is fortunate because I believe, my mother and I believe that my father was sexually molested by his father. My mother kind of figured it out. They left Pennsylvania, my father's family, good working class family from Pittsburgh. They had to leave because my father burned down someone's barn, set it on fire. Now, if a kid is acting that way, he's being abused in some way. And then my mother used to say some of the nightmares that he would have, he'd go running down the hallway screaming that he had a roll of pennies jammed into his throat. And, it doesn't take Freud to figure that one out. So we're pretty sure. And my grandfather was way creepier even than my father. He was just a moody, dark son of a bitch who never smiled or laughed. A very creepy individual. He's an auto mechanic, but just a very creepy individual. So that's that background, that side of my family.
What did your father do for a living?
Nothing. Nope. All I heard was that early when I was young, maybe 1, 2, 3 years old, he was working in a machine shop. He had mechanical skills. He lost that job and then never worked for the rest of his life.
What were his interests? How would he spend his time?
Oh, he was obsessed with World War II. And so he would build models. He would buy those Aurora plastic model kits of battleships and tanks. And he would spend the time sitting there gluing them all together, which I thought was really fascinating. And he had a whole bookcase full of these plastic Aurora models of tanks and battleships and so forth. And he was also into the supernatural and the occult. So he would buy all these magazines about UFOs and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, all that kind of shit. He was obsessed with that. And he would read books about World War II. That would be the only thing he would read, World War II.
And your stepfather, what did he do for a living?
He was a designer of aircraft engines at places like Boeing and Air Research. So he wasn't a genius inventor like my grandfather was, my maternal grandfather. But he was a worker bee, basically. Spent all his life working as an engineer on aircraft engines. Made a pretty good living at it.
And your mother, did she work?
Yeah, she all through her life, she had one job after the next, one odd job after the next. She did a lot of 9-to-5 jobs, working at banks and corporations, and she hated it all. Then she would go through periods of not working and just depending on my stepfather and drinking, then going back to work. She was always working at someplace until she finally, in her mid-40s, turned her life around, dropped the alcohol, sobered up, and then became a substance abuse counselor for the rest of her life, and for the last 15 years of her life.
And when did she pass?
Back in at the end of 2017.
And what sort of relationship did you have with her after she got sober?
Well, it was a lot better. I'll say that. She was never there for me as a kid, but she was there for me quite a bit after she sobered up. And I would have problems with my marriage. I was able to call her, and she would talk me through it. And she always had the solution. She was a much better mother, but she was bipolar too, and her bipolarity was getting worse and worse and worse over time to the point where in the last few years of her life, I could not stand her. My brother could not stand her. She was absolutely crazy. Even though she was on meds for bipolarity, they weren't working. And she would just flip from the nicest person in the world, and then all of a sudden she'd be this mean bitch who would tear you down, call you a loser, this, that, and the other thing. And pretty soon I learned not to engage with her and just walk away. Don't even, But my brother never figured that out. He would always fight with her. He liked fighting with her for some reason. He didn't understand the dynamic where you just have to walk away and wait for her mood swing to pass. So she became more and more unpleasant in those last few years.
And tell me about your genius inventor ancestor.
Yeah, that's her father. So my grandfather. His name was Samuel George Wagonseller, and he was a genius inventor. He worked. He was in the military like his father, my great grandfather, who was a military man, a major in the Army, and a graduate of Johns Hopkins Medical School, and a professional surgeon. So this guy was a big deal. And he went into World War II in a MASH unit, came back from World War II with severe PTSD. They had to put him in a straitjacket for a while. He tried to cut his own throat, and he was a surgeon, so he knew how to do it. But he did a poor job of it. He did get a little bit of brain damage from that suicide attempt, but he straightened himself out, and he was able to become a functional alcoholic, where he would pull the blinds down at 5 o'clock at night, drink hard liquor, pass out, and then get up at 5 a.m. and go do surgery the next morning. So he was an extremely functional alcoholic. So he raised my grandfather, Samuel George, and he became a genius inventor who invented, or at least perfected, the pilot's ejection seat. And he was part of the whole Southwestern space age industry that was going on in the 1950s. He was constantly moving back and forth between California, Arizona, New Mexico, and all these space age industry related jobs. He was designing atmospheric rockets that are still on display in the Smithsonian Institution. That were the first of their kind. He also designed the first talking computer, a whole bunch of stuff. But he specialized in weapons, missiles, guided missiles, but also different kinds of combustion engines for diesels and just all this kind of stuff. He was also a military man, like his father, a very competent individual, also a functional alcoholic, though only a beer drinker. He would drink beer every night. And I guess from what my mother said, he was a rageaholic. He was always yelling. It was very unpleasant to be around. And then he shot himself at the age of, I think, 43. One night he divorced my grandmother and had a new family, had a new kid, married a nurse. And I don't know what got into him. He just one night, he just used a 38 caliber to put a bullet through his head. I have no idea why. To this day, I don't know.
And is your father still alive?
Technically, yeah. My father's still alive. I have no relationship with him whatsoever.
When was the last time you had a substantial conversation with him?
I tried to, let's see. We broke it off when I was 16, and he called the house and wanted to talk to me. My brother answered, and he said, "Dad wants to talk to you." And I said, I don't want anything to do with him right now. But he's like, he wants you to talk. So I go to the phone to talk to him, and then he starts cussing me out. So I just hung up on him. And at that point, I didn't see him for a few more years. When I had an appendectomy, I was about 20 years old. I had an appendectomy. He visited me in the hospital room. So there was that contact. But after that, pretty much nothing. He developed paranoid schizophrenia over the years. My brother continued his relationship with him. So he was giving me reports on how my father was saying people were following him around in traffic. He was obsessed with people just following him around. He was very evasive. The last attempt I made to go and see him was after my ex took my kid away in 2013. I went on Father's Day. I knew where he lived. He lived with his brother. I went on Father's Day to go and see him for the first time in many years. I knocked on the door, and he answered. He said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm your son." He said, "No, you're not." And he slammed the door in my face. And that was that. That was, my brother was like, "What a dick. I'm never talking to him again." And I was like, oh, well, I think, the schizophrenia, there's no way he could recognize me anyway. So
Hmm. What were the toughest parts of writing your autobiography?
it was all pretty fun. I don't think any of it real. The Mary chapters by far were the most emotional, though. I mean, there was no way I could write them without crying. So I will say that they were hard, and I kept going over them and over them and over them and adding more and more stuff. So those are the hardest chapters in the book. Everything else up to that was pretty breezy and fun and funny. There's a lot of funny stuff. Most of the people I've known have been weird outsiders, like drug addicts, bikers, prostitutes. I knew a bank robber for a time. I knew a Tamil Tiger terrorist who was a best friend of mine for a while. All that stuff is pretty funny. As I'm reading back through it, I'm like, I don't exactly have normal friends, do I? It's these people are all underworld types that I tend to attract. So it
And
was more fun.
okay, I have to run off. So why don't you let us know any of your projects that you want to bring people's attention to, or if people would like to support your work, how can they do so?
Well, the autobiography is available on Amazon. So there's that, the literary version of it, which is way more detailed and uncensored than the YouTube stuff. I have a Patreon account, and I'm starting a brand new series on Oswald Spengler, which I'm calling the Oswald Spengler Project, because it will be much bigger than just discussing Decline of the West. It'll be discussing a bunch of different theories of history that are related to it. So it'll be a very big project. So I'm working on that on YouTube. So Patreon contributions would help keep that going. So that's it for right now.
Okay, thank you so much, John. We'll stay in touch. I really appreciate how open you've been.
Yeah, thank you, Luke, for this interview. It's been quite different.
Yeah.
Not the average interview. Do send me the link.